Great. Well, hello everyone. Thank you for coming and for joining this panel. And our title is Lessons Learned from Identity Verification in Emerging Markets. So to give you a bit of a background to this hour or so that we have together, as you know, almost 2 to 2.5 billion people across the world are legally have no identity or have no ways to legally verify or show their identity. At the same time, you have all these individuals who are financially excluded. There is 2 to 5% of the world GDP is laundered money, human trafficking, drug trafficking, terrorist financing, and so on. So there's a need for individuals to have to be able to verify themselves in order to proceed and access services, financial services, or gain basic needs such as healthcare, education, and so on. So we are the three members today on the panel who will be discussing key lessons that we have learned from our experiences. And I suppose as a starting point, it would be good to let you know briefly a little bit more about ourselves before we get started. And we will leave some time at the end for questions. So I can start with Thomas, if you'd like to briefly introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more.
Yes, thank you, Husayn. Yeah, I'm Thomas Szoke, founder of IPSIDY. Actually founded the company back in 2009. The basis of the company, IPSIDY, actually means selfhood or self-identity. Really focused on how to create a solution set to be able to do exactly what Husayn is saying. We did a lot of experience in emerging markets. My background was with government security solutions with Motorola around the world, and mostly in emerging markets, both in communications and identity. And it's just been a very interesting, our focus been in the countries in Africa, South America, and the different use cases that apply to verification. I think the key that he said is, Husayn said 2.5 million people are pretty much off-grid. And my background really was to create technology to put them on the grid or give them enabling solutions to let them participate in the digital economies of today.
Okay. Hi, I'm Adaeze Ekwueme, so I'm the CEO of Eti-Oni Development Group. So Eti-Oni is a town. It's in southwest Nigeria. It's actually home to the country's oldest cocoa plantation. And we're transforming this rural community into a sustainable smart town. And we're working in line with the UN, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals 2030. So I'm sure everybody's very familiar with chocolates. I mean, if you look at the Forbes list, the chocolate making families are usually listed as, some of the wealthiest in the world, whereas we represent the growers and, people that are producing cocoa, but then they tend to be characterized by poverty. So we're trying to find a way to add value to the natural resources, because you can't call people poor if they're surrounded by so much wealth in the form of cocoa. So we're looking for how to add value to those natural resources, such as cocoa, and by adding value, create an economic template that we can use to address some of the problems in the community. For example, health provision, education, addressing malnutrition. And we're working with Onfido as part of our Building a Smart Town. We're working with Onfido and Husayn to develop a digital identity card for the citizens and for members of the cooperative so that they can be able to access some of those social infrastructures that we're putting in place. Thank you.
Great. So I am Husayn Kassai. I'm one of the three co-founders and also the CEO at Onfido. We founded the company almost 5 years ago. And what we do is we help businesses verify the identities of the people that they're onboarding. And it's predominantly in the financial sector with banks and fintech providers and others. And then more recently, over the past year, we've done a lot more in emerging markets, which is where we partnered up with the Eti-Oni sort of NGO group and are working to help enroll a member of sort of villagers in Eti-Oni in two parts. One is to enroll and give everyone an identity. And the process is whereby every user, as part of the NGO, the villager would get enrolled and there's a capture of their face and they provide their details, their name, their age if they know it, or year of birth if not the date of birth, and that location is tagged. We then print an on-the-spot identity document, and then that is handed to the user, and there are a number of benefits that come as a result of that. And in essence, we're helping bring in these individuals into sort of the global economy by them being able to legally verify their identities. So as a starting point, it may be worth just sharing, perhaps from your experiences, some of the challenges that you have found from introducing identity verification in emerging markets.
Okay, so from our perspective, some of the challenges we faced were very fundamental. I mean, the first being a good reference database. So when you do verification, you must verify against something. And usually in emerging markets, you have situations where the reference birth certificate, birth database is handwritten in books by village. There's no centralization of that. There's nothing to reference against, and the legitimacy of that data is in question always. So a lot of times we look at how to create a reference database from the ground up, and that's been always the process with elections and national ID programs, but again, having legitimacy to that. The other part of it is when you do verification, a very simple thing called electricity, power, with devices. So you do an election, and typically it's a pickup truck with under a tree. And there's no power. So if you use a laptop in 2.5, 3 hours, you have a pile of laptops and you're back to paper ledger. So those are kind of the challenges that face verification in emerging markets today.
Okay, for me, a bit similar to Thomas. It's in terms of the data that people have. For example, I'm sure if I ask everyone here, what's your date of birth, we all know the answer. But then if I ask some people, okay, what's your friend's phone number, you might not know. So in this community, a lot of people didn't know their dates of birth. They could say, okay, I think I was born on a Friday sometime in, and that's something that we really take for granted. However, every single person knew their phone number. They all knew their friends' phone numbers, So this is just showing you how much technology has penetrated a rural community in Africa. So another aspect as well is So as I said, people don't have some of that information. There's also the perception towards government-issued identity cards. One thing, whenever people see the government coming to issue any ID card, the first thing that comes to their mind is, okay, they just want these ID cards so that they can manipulate the elections. So they look at ID cards as a way for the government to pursue some agenda or the other. So be it adding numbers to voters, or just even finding a way to fine you if you don't have a particular ID card. So they're all just very, very single use. So in our case, we're working from a bottom-up perspective. So we're working with the citizens. We are the citizens. And we have a level of verification in the sense that everybody knows everybody within a community. So if you say your name is X, there are like 10 people there who will verify that your name is X. So we're merging that traditional way of verification with the digital way of verifying, and I think we found a really robust way of trying to onboard citizens in Eti-Oni, and we're hoping we can use that as a template across similar communities on the continent.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess to add to that is, so we cover about 500 different document types, and predominantly we've focused on government-issued identity documents. But then we had increasing use cases in emerging markets where businesses would say, or partner NGOs would say, we're working with individuals who are undocumented and as well as unbanked, and therefore there's no data infrastructure whatsoever. So starting out, this lack of infrastructure to begin with, be it a reference database or individuals not fully knowing precisely their legal whether there's a full date of birth or just a year of birth, and sometimes even name, their full legal name and others. Whereby traditionally you've relied upon a government-based top-down means of giving everyone an identity, and someone coming from outside of town trying to enroll everyone. If there's a trust lack or issue there, then individuals may not enroll and may not be part of it, which is why this marriage of combining a means by which locals who know each other and the NGO that they trust is part of the enrollment process, and a digitalization layer on top that captures everything and helps everyone to be verified seems to have worked quite well. And so before I go on to the next question, I'll just, to make it real for how this process works in Eti-Oni, we can see that the NGO partner, all they would need is about a $50 device, a smartphone kind of device with a camera, where they go and they take an image of the face of the individuals that they're looking to enroll. And these are unbanked and typically undocumented individuals to begin with. And they'd enter their name as best the individual knows it, and equally, if not a full date of birth, at least just a year of birth. And then the location where they are enrolled is also tagged. And then using another $50 or so portable printer, an ID document is printed and laminated on the spot and provided to the individual. And that individual is therefore enrolled moving forward. And the identity document looks quite simple, looks pretty much like this. And as part of this pilot, there are 2 phases. And the first phase is that these individuals gaining access to sort of healthcare services once a month would be able to go, show their ID to this health box, show their ID, show their face, and gain access to the services. And should someone from a village nearby look to steal or cheat the system by using someone else's ID documents, they would be prevented, because the engine would say, or the smartphone would say that no, this person's face is not equal to their, or is not consistent with their ID documents, for example. And that's essentially is how this part of it works. And I suppose in a similar way, it would be great to learn from you as to how technology has helped you introduce identity verification in more of the emerging markets, especially what is new now versus why it wouldn't be as much of an option, say 5 or even 10 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I think technology today, I mean, it's just moving at such a pace forward. But one of the key elements to it is mobile connectedness. So as I think Husayn is showing with the mobile application, 5, 10 years ago, you didn't have that mobile penetration. Is really the emerging markets that are leapfrogging, again, the developed areas to deploy mobile type solutions, because there's no legacy to go back to. I think based on that, it's making the work a lot easier, because before you had to carry around a lot of very expensive equipment to achieve these type of objectives. $1,000 kits, I mean, $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 kits. There was elections 5, 10 years ago. It's literally a suitcase that weighs about 90 to 100 pounds you carry around and you deploy in villages and enroll people. It's not saying they don't do it today still, but the onset of mobile creates a whole new dynamic to that, giving more flexibility. I think just want to add one comment, though. One of the important things is that identity card, from our perspective and what we've seen in our history, is something the owner of that card actually takes pride of. It's the first document they have. A lot of these emerging markets, they don't issue credentials or never had a credential. So ironically, they take very good care of it, better than we do in the developed countries. So it's a sense of pride. So it's a very unique way of connecting people to technology and let them have ownership of it. So I think that's one of the things verification and the solutions bring.
Yeah. And just to, I guess, build up on why you decided to go for a bottom-up approach, where you as an NGO would look to introduce an identity verification system to enable some of the services, and why not wait for, say, the government to come and do so, as it traditionally has done?
Yeah, so, in terms of ID cards, I'll say, okay, Eti-Oni is a town. It's in a state called Osun. Now, in Nigeria, Osun has what they call a state ID card. Then we have a Nigerian national identity card. And I think every 5 years or so, there's some form of new ID card or a voter's registration card or something. But all these cards are just for one single use, and people's perceptions of them or experiences with them haven't been very good. So with this one was that we're driving this Smart Town initiative, and we said, okay, we need to get an identity card that actually does something, that has multiple uses. So with this QR code, we can find out if they're eligible or if they're members of the community and they can use the health services we're providing. We can track, their contributions to the cooperative society, their financial contributions. Later on, it can lead to financial inclusion as well. So why we're doing this Smart Town initiative, we're actually doing it as an NGO with very little to no government help, because the problems we have in Africa in terms of the rising population and urbanization, our cities aren't equipped to deal with the way we're going. Nigeria, we're 180 million people, and we're projected to be 350 million people by 2050. So what's happening now is that the governments are still trying to play catch up. So they're like, okay, we have 180 million people now. Let's start building infrastructure for that 180 million people. And of course, we're all going to be messed up in the next 5 to 10 years because we're growing quite exponentially. So with this ID card, we're actually able to get useful information and metrics, and we can actually plan exactly where we're growing and exactly where we're going to. And we can, develop and design our community in tandem with where we're going to.
And naturally, it's very much part of the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030 to give a legal identity to those who are currently do not have one. And it's when we looked into this a little bit more, because naturally as a company, we'd much rather partner or work more in countries where there's already an established identity verification or at least identity document infrastructure, the Indian Aadhaar card system being the best example. But you hear of cases whereby the United Nations predominantly would run a program and then provide some form of identity for an election, and then after the election's up, it's sort of all deleted, which is quite frustrating for us because there's a lot of effort that goes into that as well as costs and other things. And there's another issue whereby just people not trusting what is the motive behind this form of document. And if it's just a purely voter ID card, that may not necessarily be sufficient or good enough for the purposes of identity verification to gain access to services or financial products and other things. Even the US social security number, that is now used quite a bit as for identity purposes, but it actually was never designed for that purpose. It serves that regardless, but it was kind of inferior to that. And so when we saw that there's not just essentially a gap whereby something so simple as basic technology could be used to enable so much more trade and access to services, we thought it'd be quite easy to do. And as well as the connectivity points that was raised by Thomas and all the things around the need from a bottom-up perspective, we saw in parallel there is not only the internet, rise of the internet access and others, but machine learning now can play a pivotal role in helping algorithms detect whether identity documents are legitimate or not using a simple smartphone and a simple webcam. So there's no longer a need for there to be a face-to-face interaction and things of that nature. And equally, biometrics and captures of the person's face and deciding whether that is the same as someone else from a human perspective compared to computer vision and sort of machine learning-based facial recognition, is the comparison sort of almost 2 years ago is clearly proven scientifically that machine learning-based facial recognition is superior to what the human eye traditionally is able to do. And so that brings me on to the question around where you think, Thomas, the future will be in terms of emerging markets and how they both have identity documents as well as how identity verification is carried out more broadly.
Well, I think the future, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, is through mobile connectedness, digital identity be proliferated to emerging markets. I mean, I think people need it. They are limited in their access to the digital economy. All the benefits of electronic connectedness in learning and medicine, all those areas, those are the parts of the world that need it the most. But the key problem you have is you don't know who you're giving it to, whether it legitimately should be receiving it, and how that's being managed. And it's all revolving around identity. I think the mobile connectedness and the investment, the operators. I mean, in Nigeria, MTN, the coverage is better than here in DC. And it's true. I mean, there are parameters, their infrastructure is so well in place to cover the territories because there's no other. So people rely on it. And leveraging that and going forward, I think they're recognizing, the operators are recognizing they're a key element to the success of those countries to move ahead in their economy, in their education, their health. So I think it's going to become a very rapid curve, similar to what happened with wireless communications. If you remember, the countries with no landlines became the first ones to have over 100% penetration because they had no other. And it was the first thing to move. So I think the identity with mobility will be the same result.
Equally, what are some of the projects that you're now enabled to, once the identity verification infrastructure is built into Eti-Oni, some of the projects you're able to now run as part of the Sustainable Development Goals?
Okay, so for the identity, that's SDG 16.9, and that's giving a legal identity to the citizens. We're also looking at SDG 3, that's the health provision of health with our mobile clinic. The IDs are a good point. You know, as Thomas just said with MTN, you know, for us as an NGO, SDGs, I think it's 11, or 17, which is about finding partnerships. And, you know, for us having to work, because we're in quite a remote and rural area, but, you know, we've been able to work with Onfido on this ID card. We're also working with MTN as well as our data partners, you know, so we have a few partners that we're working with. And, you know, I think the future really of in emerging markets with this ID, you know, we're still looking at citizens and everything. But for us, coming from a cocoa producing community, I mean, most of the chocolate that's being sold here, it has labels on it saying fair trade. And people say, okay, well, this is fair trade somewhere. But, we can even take identity, and that's where emerging markets come in. Because we don't have too much infrastructure, we're able to leapfrog and maybe come up with some ideas that, may not be thought of here. But imagine if you could buy a bar of chocolate and see a QR code and say, okay, well, this was made from 5 different beans, from 5 different plantations, and be able to trace. So I think we can actually take it in emerging markets a lot further because we have a lot of things that aren't in place. Yeah.
Understood. And so to build on that future point, and one of the things that we think will happen in the future is whereby users may be able to even use biometrics to make payments, and that cash may no longer be relevant. And there are cases, obviously, you have the selfie pay and other services. But in emerging markets, there may well be scope for that to be one of the leapfrog adaptations and technologies too. And the way that essentially works is there are 2 parts to this pilot. The first is to just enroll everyone, give everyone their legal identity with this ID document. And then as and when they want to access services, say once a month, they would go to the health clinic and show their ID card, show their face and be enrolled, or gain access to, let's say, a sack of rice once a month and so on. And it would prevent someone else coming over and claiming the same, say, the next day. They would have to wait 30 days because the device would say this person's already been verified. If I'm the person and someone has stolen my ID card and tries to come back, it would say that that person's face is not consistent with the details and the QR code and so on these documents. If, from an NGO perspective, say there's a corrupt NGO and they have 10 sacks of rice to hand out on a Monday, and they go to the next village and offload that illegally or with malicious intent, again, there needs to be an audit log of 10 unique faces having been captured and 10 unique identities where these goods were sort of handed out. And all these things that come as part of the phase 1. But phase 2, regarding the future, which is going to be next year, is to see if there's scope to enable payments with just a person's face. And essentially, the way that would work is that, well, first of all, insofar as the problem, 90% of the emerging markets deal with cash. And there are problems around theft, fakes, and everything else that goes in between. But if you imagine there are 10 people in a village, 2 are sellers and 8 are buyers, the sellers, all they would need is a simple $50 device. And then if everyone has a digital wallet, so to speak, which has $10 credit in it, for example, then the 8 buyers could come, and if I'm the seller and I'm looking to sell a pen for $5, then all I would need is this device. And they would hold their ID documents, they'd show their face, they'd approve the $5, they would get their pen, and then that buyer's credits would go from $10 to $5, and me as a seller, mine would go from 10 to 15. And when that is extended to other needs, such as cocoa farmers going and selling their goods, if there's only 1 or 2 purchasers in the whole community, but there are those who provide the data and other means by which there is more transparency around what is happening, and it cuts out all the fees and things that are associated with the cash, then there may be scope for the purchasers to gain better rates. And the adoption of technology in this has already been proven in the fishing market, if none other, where by fishing boats, they'd go out and sort of catch fish, and on their phone, they'd be able to check where can I get the best price for today's catch, and they would sort of decide where to go accordingly, and that market has already been proven. So it's moving towards a stage whereby you can use all these different building blocks of the technology, being internet connectivity, biometrics, machine learning, asymmetric cryptography, and a whole range of other things to be able to empower individuals to interact more effectively and be able to show their legal identity. And so I want to save some time for questions in just a second. Before I do, any other remarks or points regarding the lessons learned in the emerging markets?
No, I think what Husayn is saying is the emerging markets is the place where fintech and closed payment platforms are going to flourish the most, as long as you wrap them with identity. As you've seen, there's a lot of articles out there about how the fintech technologies being deployed today don't protect adequately the transactions. And how do you do those things? So there's a lot of challenges out there because of the identity and doing the source of the individual making the payment or collecting the funds. How do you manage that? But I think with the technologies out there in the identity space, the closed loop platforms, I think this is going to be the opportune place for this to roll out. And I think banks are going to adopt to it because at the end of the day, you still need the financial institutions to hold the money. And I think they are finding themselves into situations where they're seeing the opportunities come to fruition, where closed-loop platforms are very, I guess, advantageous for them to participate versus the traditional way of the credit cards, debit cards, and high-feed type of transactions that these kind of markets are sensitive to. So I just wanted to comment.
Yeah, just wherever there are challenges, there are always opportunities, you know. In Africa, with the rise of mobile penetration, for example, MTN in Nigeria has, I think, 60 million subscribers. That's about almost the population of the United Kingdom, you know, and that's just one mobile phones company. That's just their market in one country. So, you know, there's so because of these challenges, the opportunities, there's room for growth, and there's also a lot of room for innovation, because these are systems where, as I said, things don't work perfectly. So I think when one is moving to work in an emerging market, you know, it's good to bear in mind that you're not going to be able to go to a government office and say, oh, I need this information or this data. I mean, nobody's going to, you know, they probably laugh, you know. So it's just to bear in mind that, you know, things are very different, and things don't always work how they should work, and that also provides a lot of opportunities.
Yeah, I suppose just to conclude, there is not the size of the opportunity is clear, in that there are so many people who are being left behind purely because they have no means to show their legal identity, and yet the problems have existed for a long time, but new technologies are enabled to are helping us overcome these. And naturally, the evidence being sort of a 1% increase in financial inclusion is a 3.6% increase in GDP. So it's a significant uplift insofar as a contribution and what can go into. And great. So on that note, we can open up to questions. So maybe while we wait, I can start with a question around, you mentioned regulation, and there being at times, lack of regulation, especially in emerging markets, which can help new technologies be adopted at times, but it also leaves the issue of exploitation when you don't have regulation. So from your experience, have you seen that come about? And if so, what do you think the best way to address that would be?
I mean, there's two types. There's regulation drives a couple things. So in the emerging market themselves, I mean, there's local regulation, which is sometimes not well enough defined or changes too often. So for technology companies to come in and invest in platforms, provide services around regulation, which is subject to change within terms of elections, is complex, and it's an investment you take a risk at. And I think you were saying it as, you know, there's a lot of benefit and reward. There's a lot of things you have to deal with to be able to get there. That's one of them. I think global standardization is important. So I think the standards that are coming out around identity is key, because if those governments can adopt to those standards, which there's pressure from all angles, it helps companies develop the technology around them and deploy them. And it gives you a little bit of assurance that you're on the right path. So I think from a regulatory standpoint, that's really been the issue. One, if you focus on local, you really don't know how long that stays and how much change goes about. With the globalization of these standards that are coming about, how are you going to help that? And I think it's making things easier to make investment decisions.
Has that been an issue in your experience?
Not really, because as I said, with these ID cards, it's, I mean, I have to explain this to you. It's not that if you give someone your driver's license, they're not going to be able to find anything biometric to say, oh, you have this many speeding tickets, or you have, your driver's license is literally just a card. To even get it issued to you, you go to City Hall and you take your picture. You don't even enter a car to drive it, to test, you know, so it's just, we just have so many things that are just cards and just, you know, and aren't really providing much services. So for us, with this ID card, this is something people can use to, as I said, access health services, track their financial contributions, you know, even access social housing. So that's why we're sort of working, you know, we're coming from somewhere where we have what we call institutional voids. So the government isn't as much a provider of services for us as it is in, let's say, more in the Western countries. So it's a little bit different.
Yeah. Question?
Yes, I'm interested in how the facial recognition data is stored, whether there are any privacy or security concerns. And just to follow up with what you said, in the United States, for example, you can scan the back of a driver's license now, and it has a lot more information. But states have limited the ability of, for example, merchants to do that for privacy concerns. So, it seems like, at least in the U.S., we're always going to have the battle between privacy, security, and all that. So I'm just interested in what y'all's thoughts are.
Yeah, absolutely. And privacy is not only an important thing, but something that those who are, say, banked or have a credit file as such, are becoming increasingly frustrated with, because we think that we have no control over it. Identity theft is the fastest growing crime in the US. It's already one of the largest crimes, and it's a source of frustration. So the great thing with the cutting edge technology is that you could use asymmetric cryptography and a means by which you respect privacy while ensuring you maintain security. And when facial recognition comes into sort of the story, it's the facial recognition and details being stored into a code that is added to the document itself. And then that piece is essentially deleted. That's no longer needed. So it's every time a person comes in and is verified again, it's at that point their face is then rechecked against the document details. So no data is stored as such. And what asymmetric cryptography does is say my face is captured, it's turned into a series of zeros and ones that cannot be reverse engineered. So if my face is turned into a code, and that code for whatever reason is stolen or leaks or for somehow finds it's in the hands of those with malicious intent, they would never be able to recreate my face. However,
Because it's encrypted, or because
it's asymmetric cryptography, so it's one way but not two ways. So my face on a Monday is turned into a code the code by itself can never regenerate my face. However, if my face in the code is captured on Monday and then my face in the code on Wednesday, the two codes can be checked. So it's the user would have to provide their face again in a second time period in order for them to be verified in that way. But it is a big and growing issue around privacy, and using this kind of method helps overcome that.
I think the Neil Wasserman time wave analytics, the easy part, I think, is the technology. I mean, there are many ways of verifying facial identity, iris identity. I mean, those technologies are available. My question is, who finances this? I mean, it should be considered, I would think, part of the infrastructure of emerging markets, which is traditionally financed by USAID, Overseas Private Investment Corporation, the World Bank. I mean, they finance infrastructure development that meets certain criteria, and this capability, I would think, should be considered part of the infrastructure for economic development. Are these organizations receptive to that perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. It'd be good to get your perspectives in a second. But for us, absolutely. There are sort of United Nations agencies, be it Gates Foundations, other foundations who are looking for means of implementing identity verification programs, and can see there's, I guess, somewhat of a source of frustration to wait for the government to do it, and the downsides of it being centralized, and separately for, say, an NGO or an institute to want to roll these out themselves regardless. So this part of this pilot is essentially to prove that that works, and therefore to prove that it can work on a scalable way, not just in one village, but in a dozen, and then eventually a whole country. So the answer to your question is that it is the proof points being in that you no longer need a government centralized way to do so. It can be rolled out another way. It's just we have found partnerships with NGOs purely for that trust factor, and for the protection and everything else goes with it, tends to be a good model that works. But it is hopefully, as and when more pilots go live and the test use cases are shown, then it would be for governments and others to partner and take that on board. Because as you say, technology is not necessarily the most tricky parts. And I suppose you're already working quite actively with a number of governments.
Well, I mean, we've done elections in Africa, in Ghana, Zambia, Malawi, Guinea, and it's usually UNDP, European Union funds, USAID. I mean, it's usually been those organizations you mentioned that are interested, but election-centric. So, I mean, a lot of this has always said one person, one vote. How do I ensure that? How do I maintain the sovereignty of a nation and creating those databases? What we said earlier was interesting enough, because it's funded by those agencies and not a ground-up initiative, the data is never used for anything else. So we create systems where we put in millions and millions. We just did election last year in 2016 for Zambia. 6 million records, deduplicated for a voter registry, and it's not used.
Yeah.
So, you know, the government itself doesn't want to use it. So it's a difficult challenge, and I think that's one of the things that we're trying to push with local governments to say, start using the data that's funded externally, the creation of it, to other applications, like what they're doing here. It's a challenge because the other side is we haven't seen grassroots funded from large organizations, right? They usually go to the government and fund them. And it's usually a relationship that's built between the governments and the different institutions to get large amounts of money to do these processes. Like I said, it's usually election-centric. So that's an interesting challenge, right, to build that funding. The other side's been, we've done projects in South America where it's funded by the company. We do a transactional model. So we've done it in Colombia. We do a solution for postal service, doing counter-to-counter transactions for people to be able to send money to the unbanked. Fair transit collection systems for ticketing. We finance the hardware and we get a transaction model. So those are tough as well because, you know, you have to justify it, and the question we talked about before, regulation stability become a question. Can you get your money back? In what time frame? So these are things that have really been a challenge, you know, to look at in these markets. And I agree, that's the number one problem. Yeah.
Well, this becomes one more argument for advocating stability in U.S. infrastructure building programs in foreign markets. Unfortunately, in the indicated budgets, for example, OPIC is zeroed out, Overseas Private Investment Corporation is zeroed out, and their total investment is something like, I don't know, 20 billion, 30 billion. They make money for the government. China is investing $1 trillion.
Yeah.
I mean, we need to get on a page that makes economic sense for global development.
It's a very valid point because it hurts American companies because the Chinese funds obviously will funnel to different areas. So we are challenged to enter some markets because funding sources are difficult to find as a private sector, right? So it's a very competitive market.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
Then naturally, given that there's a tendency for these organizations to fund and run these programs, there becomes a dependency on the government on those as well, whereby one of the reasons why the Millennium Development Goals weren't as successful as hopefully the Sustainable Development Goals will be is because the data would be captured and then, as we mentioned, it would sort of be deleted, and that would stop or prevent the government from using the data to plan accordingly, plan for the future, be it census data or otherwise. And a lot of the data that is captured in these emerging markets for the government to make their plans, again, comes from the UN and other places, whereby, and in addition to all of these issues, the main one being that for these agencies to get a program running, you're talking 5-10 years or longer, whereas sort of from a startup world, you talk about days, not months or years. So given that the technology existed, the use case, the need existed, we sort of started regardless, mostly for the speed purpose. Anything to add on your side?
Well, it's just basically what Thomas said as well, because of the way funding comes from the UN and international organizations. It's a top-down approach, whereas that means that if the UN wants to give you money or the World Bank, they first go and meet your government. So if it's me as an NGO, I wouldn't get that money directly, even if I prove that I do need it. So they'll go to my government, give them the money. So it can go from my federal government to my state government before it comes to me in my local government, or in fact in my town, in my local government. I'll just give one very quick example. So we're the oldest cocoa community in Nigeria, the oldest cocoa plantation. We've been producing cocoa since 1896, 120 years. So the World Bank found out about Eti-Oni through the former Minister of Agriculture and said, oh, why don't they have a road that works well? You know, we're going to give you a World Bank assisted, we're going to give you funding to fix the road in Eti-Oni. So that could probably help the farmers to get better money for their produce because they have access to roads. So that money gets from the World Bank to a federal level, and then they find out that, okay, the road belongs to, let's say, the state. So it gets to the state, and then from the state, they can say, okay, well, we don't really know Eti-Oni, but we know we need another road in this other place. So why don't we just build 26 kilometers of road in XYZ community 5 miles away? Because that is what we need the money for. And the World Bank has given us the money. So the World Bank would come, and then they'd find out, so was a road done? And they'll say, yes, we've done 26 kilometers of road in Osun State. We gave the money to the state government. And that's all they want to know. They won't, or they can even say they went to the local government, and then that's where they stop. They won't come to the actual community. So I'm telling you that, yeah, somebody can come and say, well, I don't see why I should give Eti-Oni a road, whereas my wife's village doesn't have a road, or my village doesn't have a road. So some of these international organizations may be there to help, but the money, I mean, it's not to be crude, but if you wanted to give someone like a child money, you won't give the money to their alcoholic dad to spend it on booze. That's all I'm saying.
Hi, I'm curious how you deal with how you prevent duplicate records. Are you using facial recognition for that, or is it only for verification? And how do you address that challenge?
Good question. So duplicate records become a problem whereby it is just one factor or authentication. So what we have here is there's a need for your ID documents to be held first, and then it's your face. So there's two. Your ID document is something you have, and your face is something that you essentially are. So it then becomes a one-to-one match. And there's a question around if you were to then say you have misplaced your card, but you'd want it back, then you'd have to provide your details, whether it's just your year of birth, your location, i.e. the village in which you were enrolled, and your other details, so that your record could be pulled, and then you could be issued a new version. And something else to say that may not even be surprising, but in most local villages, fraud is a very small issue. It's not an issue because everyone knows each other anyway. It's just a case of when they need to interact with those outside of that village because of, let's say, there's access to a service in that village, and those come from other villages, is to ensure that there's no sort of malicious intent in that sense. Or if there's trading with a, say, cocoa purchaser that comes once every 2 months, and to ensure that they're getting the right, they're transferring the right amounts to the right person and so on. So it's very rare for there to be malicious intent as such, but this will become more important to show it that it works well in one region before it's scaled, so that those issues don't come up. Well, great. I think that just about wraps it up. Unless there are any other questions, I'd like to thank you all for joining, and also my fellow panelists for sharing their thoughts.
Thank you, sir.